Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we'll be asking, where are the EU sanctions on Israel? Joining us on the show is Nashashebi, an award-winning journalist and analyst on Arab affairs. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start off with what's taking place in Palestine.
Well, what would you like to discuss? There's a lot taking place.
According to this, with the sanctions, as that's what we're focusing on.
Yeah, well, so there was a meeting of EU foreign ministers last week, and the new foreign policy chief for the EU denied allegations made in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, that the EU were planning sanctions against Israel if it continued to act in ways that hindered a two-state solution. So I think, firstly, it's very disappointing that there may not be sanctions considered on Israel, but also I thought it was extremely irresponsible and dangerous for her to say that no sanctions are being planned, because that basically gives the message to Israel that it can do it at once and there's not going to be any punitive measures. And you can see everything that it's doing to the Palestinians, and given the impunity it already enjoys because of American support and the veto in the UN Security Council, the fact that the EU, which is Israel's biggest trading partner and could have huge leverage on Israel, says we're not thinking of sanctions. This is a really dangerous game that is being played right now.
So in the newspaper, they mentioned that there's going to be a sanction.
Yeah, well, Haaretz, they said that there was an internal draft EU document that tabled various sanctions, and it's intriguing because on the day that the new foreign policy chief denied that, Haaretz actually published the document. So it's quite an intriguing affair, and Haaretz is a respected newspaper, and it seemed to be well sourced, well researched, and verified. So it's quite an intriguing affair. But in any case, even if the document is genuine, the fact that this foreign policy chief came out and said we're not planning anything like that, well, you're basically telling Israel do what you want, and this is just a very irresponsible thing to do.
As you're saying that the newspaper is very reliable, can we just say that the foreign minister isn't actually, speaking the full truth, and that because they have the document printed, that means that is actually going to be happening? It's
possible, but then if I was her, I mean, to say that something doesn't exist, if it did exist and it would eventually come to light, it would make me look foolish. So I don't know why I would deny something that I know exists and may come to the public light eventually. So I don't know. It's an intriguing affair. It's difficult to say exactly what's what.
But don't you think she would do that because the EU is, in good terms with Israel, and they have a lot of businesses and trade between one another, that she wouldn't want to say that out loud and publicly, so people continue to buy from Israel, buy Israeli products?
I mean, I don't think it's a morally or strategically tenable situation where you have a trading partner or any kind of partner that is such a human rights abuser as Israel is, and say, well, to keep that relationship, we're going to keep quiet and keep supporting a country that commits those abuses. I don't think that's a tenable situation. The EU has the power, in terms of trade, it's the biggest trading partner of Israel. It has the power to have decisive leverage over Israel. And the fact that it says, well, we're going to keep quiet, just because we have this partnership. The EU-Israel Association Agreement, which is the basis for their ties, says that these ties must be based on human rights and democratic principles. Israel's violating human rights, and in terms of democratic principles for its Arab citizens, it doesn't exist. So, I mean, I don't know how the EU legally, according to this association agreement, can claim that Israel is abiding by those terms.
But then this is what's been happening all the time. When we look at the agreements and even just all the way back to the Balfour Declaration, they've always stated that they have to support the Palestinians, that nothing, harmful or bad would actually happen to the Palestinians. They'll be treated equally. But that's never what, people actually go by, politicians go by. It's always, to support Israel. So isn't it just like what's always been happening?
Well, the reason why I think the EU, if this is the case that it's not considering sanctions, it is woefully out of step with European public opinion. If you look at polls throughout the European countries, sympathy for the Palestinians, there are far more Europeans who sympathize with the Palestinians than those who sympathize with Israel. Even in countries whose governments have a particularly close relationship with Israel. And it's also out of step with the various moves being taken now by EU parliaments to recognize a Palestinian state. I mean, it's going against the will of elected MPs and of electorates and populations in democratic countries. So it's a very puzzling situation that the EU would officially ignore such an overwhelming tide of opinion simply to keep relations with Israel, because they're elected representatives, and the electorates are saying no, this is not an acceptable situation. So it needs to listen to its own people.
It needs to listen, but it doesn't kind of it always. The parliament itself or a government would always do what they have according to their agenda. They don't actually always respond to their people.
Well, I think there may or will come a time eventually where there will be such a gap between public opinion and policy that I think something will have to change. In democratic countries, you can only go so far by ignoring the will of the people and your own parliaments. Something's going to have to change. That can't continue indefinitely. So I don't think this is, in the long term, this cannot be something that the EU can continue. It's going to have to reckon with that. And if it doesn't, it has to look, if certain governments are looking out for the interests of Israel, it has to realize if Europeans see that the EU as an official body is not going to express objection to Israeli policies, then this is going to further bolster the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement against Israel, which is already making great strides in Europe. And I think if people see that that's the only effective avenue to sanction Israel, then it's going to increase that movement. So I think the EU, if it thinks it's covering Israel's back, for example, I don't think this is the case. It will simply drive people to the BDS movement, to say, well, if this is our only avenue, we're going to more fully support that.
When we look at the report that the newspaper gave, they mentioned something that the sanctions is going to be making the two-state solution impossible.
Well, they would sanction Israel if it continued to act in ways that made its two-state solution impossible, which there's ample evidence it's doing that as we speak. The problem is the sanctions, if you read, there are numerous sanctions reported, but many of them, they're not very strong anyway. It was, a lot of it was things like, more strongly worded statements. So, the EU might stop saying please, for example, but they're not very strong sanctions. So even that, it wasn't something that, the Israeli government, I think, would be particularly petrified by. And that adds to the whole sense that the EU is being really supine when it comes to Israel, because not only are they apparently not considering sanctions, but the sanctions that reportedly were being considered were not really groundbreaking.
Thing is, with the two-state solution, we all know that Israel isn't actually going to be doing that, as more and more settlers are going into, Palestine, and Jerusalem is just being taken over by Israelis. Like, with this, they keep telling us two-state solution and they keep telling us one-state solution, and we know neither of them is what Israel wants. Do they keep just telling us solution just so to keep us all quiet?
I think the situation has gone beyond saying that Israel is refusing to implement its two-state solution, because even if theoretically, and this is a far-off theory, that there would be an Israeli government that would be willing to countenance a viable Palestinian state on occupied territories. It's that we've passed that point now. It would actually be physically I don't see how it would be possible with so many settlers, and the road network throughout Israel, and the checkpoints, and the cutting off of East Jerusalem from the West Bank. With all these things, how is Israel going to implement a Palestinian state, even if it wanted to, and it doesn't want to? But if there was such an uproar about uprooting several thousand settlers from Gaza, you're talking about several 100,000 settlers in the West Bank. That's not going to happen. So we've passed the point of a two-state solution. That's over. I think people who keep talking about a two-state solution, I think that you can divide them into two categories. One are people who know it's a delusion, but they want people to keep believing it so that we continue with this indefinite, futile peace process. And then there are people who are deluding themselves into saying this is still possible and we should continue that. And the problem with that is, as long as this delusion persists, people are not seriously considering the idea of a one-state solution and how we go about achieving a one-state solution in an equitable way. People are not considering that, but the problem is two states, it's finished. We've passed that point. Israel has been the biggest, although it's the biggest opponent of the idea of a binational state or a one-state solution. It has been the biggest on the ground, the biggest proponent of it, because they've made sure that the Palestinians cannot have a viable state anymore.
But then even with the one-state solution, we all know that the Israeli government want it to be Jews and Jews only.
Yeah.
And then full stop, they don't even negotiate that point. So then we also know the one-state solution is also like it's dead.
Well, yeah, I mean, but you could say the same about South Africa, for example, that the white administration in South Africa refused the idea of the end of apartheid, for instance. But apartheid ended despite their objections. You reach a critical mass where the pressure of maintaining apartheid the cost was too great, and the regime couldn't continue. We may reach that point in terms of Israel where the cost of the occupation is too much to bear, and despite their objections, you would not be able to ignore the fact that, I mean, demographically, if you look, for example, at the whole area, Israel and the occupied territories, there is numerical parity at the moment between Arabs and Jews in the territory. The Arabs are going to increase them in number pretty soon. So if they continue in the situation where you have one state, but it's basically an apartheid state, again, eventually you can't maintain that. And I think world opinion is shifting decisively, particularly in regions and countries where Israel has traditionally enjoyed support. And you have demographic pressures in Israel itself. So Israel has really put itself in a corner where it won't accept a Palestinian state, and then it somehow thinks that it can indefinitely enslave Palestinians in a one-state solution where they have no rights. I think that's not a tenable situation. Israel is going to have a reckoning at some point where whatever it wants to do, it's going to have to accept it cannot keep millions of people as second-class citizens or as an occupied people with no rights.
But they kind of already do. Like the Arabs that are living in Israel, the Arab Israelis, they are treated as second class. They're not actually treated just like another Israeli civilian.
Yeah, but this is a situation, as time goes by, it's becoming more untenable. I mean, now they have this bill that the cabinet has approved to define Israel as the Jewish nation state. And this is bringing up a lot of opposition among Israelis. The Israeli Arab community is in uproar, and this is causing increasing international criticism. If you look at the wider picture, for example, just take this year alone. The invasion of Gaza, running rampage in the West Bank, the provocations in East Jerusalem, now the provocations against its Arab citizens. There has been such a tide of international criticism of Israel that it's almost like a country gone mad. It doesn't, it just keeps lashing out, but it is isolating itself more and more in the international community. It cannot continue indefinitely like that. So I don't think its policies have any kind of long-term strategic kind of advantage for Israel, because it's going to reap what it's sowing at the moment.
But then, like you mentioned how a lot of nations have changed and they've shifted, which we actually do see. But then the politicians themselves, they're still in the same position. Like if we look at America, if we look at the United Kingdom, it's all the same. Like they're still helping the government, not the parliament, but the government is still helping Israel. When we example, had the whole voting to see if Palestine should be recognized as a state, our main politicians just stepped back and said they're not going to be getting involved. So with that, is it going to be a next, a few more years until it changes?
Look, I mean, I think in terms of change, if you're talking about America, that's the furthest away that we're going to see change. But for instance, in the UK, if you look at the parliamentary vote on recognizing Palestine, of the three main parties, the Liberal Democrats support the recognition of Palestine as a party policy, and Labour was strongly behind this. Even Ed Miliband, the Labour Party leader, who is Jewish, who said he wants to be the country's first Jewish prime minister, he publicly wanted his MPs to support this, and Labour MPs did support this. It was only the Conservatives that didn't. But even then, there has been a growing number of voices within the Conservative Party saying that we cannot continue supporting Israel because of what it's doing. And this has been, in terms of the political parties, this has been a party traditionally, unflinchingly supportive of Israel. And increasingly important figures in there are saying we can't do this anymore. Things have gone too far. So I think the situation in Britain is changing. Public opinion in Britain has traditionally been, I mean, according to opinion polls, the number of people sympathizing with the Palestinians outnumber those who sympathize with Israel by more than 2 to 1. So that's changing. And if you look at the various parliamentary bills across Europe, I mean, if such a bill passed overwhelmingly in Britain, it's a foregone conclusion this will happen across Europe. So I think it's going to be more and more difficult for governments to turn a blind eye to this. And the situation in Europe has changed. If you look, for example, at the situation in Europe compared to like 10, 20 years ago, the landscape has shifted incredibly and not in Israel's favor at all. So I think things are changing. I think part of the problem as well is the Palestinian Authority has shown itself to be so inept in terms of pursuing strategies that further Palestinian rights and national aspirations. This is as much a problem, I think, as Israeli intransigence, is that Palestinians don't have a leadership that seems at all capable, or in ways even willing, to pursue certain strategies. And I think this is as much of a problem. They have a dual problem of an occupying power and an institution, the Palestinian Authority, that is seen more and more, and justifiably, as just an entity that Israel subcontracts the occupation to, that it manages the occupation for it. I think the PA is going to have a reckoning as well.
What is the Palestinian government actually doing?
Exactly. What is it doing? It's, you know, it managed to get an upgraded status at the UN. This was 2 years ago. Immediately after that, the reason why it was so opposed by Israel and America was that it enabled them then to join the International Criminal Court. Since then, we've heard time and again promises to join the ICC. We are still no closer to joining the ICC. Apparently, it was reported that during the Gaza invasion, Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president, stopped the application to the ICC. During Israel's invasion of Gaza.
He stopped it?
Yes. Apparently Saab Arakat, the chief negotiator, reportedly there was a leaked audio recording saying that Mahmoud Abbas had made a commitment to Netanyahu to not further the ICC application. What else? The Palestinian Authority refuses to endorse the BDS movement. Mahmoud Abbas said this while in South Africa, of all places, that he wouldn't endorse the BDS movement. It's refusing, at the moment, its latest excuse for not joining the ICC was that it first wanted to table a resolution in the UN to demand a timetable for an Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. Now that's being shelved. So there's constantly excuses not to pursue these very vital strategies.
Why though? What is this? I
think it's self-preservation. The Palestinian Authority wants to maintain its existence. It has been quite vocal about the fact that if it pursues these policies, funding from the US would be cut off, which would basically be a critical blow to the Palestinian Authority. So basically, these are politicians who want to keep their jobs, and it's self-preservation. But in the meantime, they are not pursuing the rights of their own people, which should be the very reason why the PA exists. It's not to serve the Israeli occupation. It's not to manage the occupation for Israel. It's to serve its own people. And yet Mahmoud Abbas, I think it was in May this year, had the gall to say that security cooperation with Israel was sacred. That's the word he used. When he says cooperation with an occupying power that's occupying the PA's own people is sacred. It's treason. It's treason. It's nothing less than that.
No, but then, like, you're saying it's self-preservation, but then shouldn't they be worried that the actual nation is going to be against them and want to vote for another? They should be very worried.
They should be worried. And yet, the Palestinian Authority foreign minister said earlier this year that as long as Abbas is in power, there will be no third intifada. And I think the reason he said that is they are fully aware that if there is another intifada, this would be as much against the Palestinian Authority as against Israel. But what does the PA, is it actually going to forcibly oppose an intifada? Is it going to fight its own people? I mean, look, so far the demonstrations that have taken place against the PA for its policies, they've been brutally put down. So you have, the PA is not just working with the occupying power, it's abusing Palestinian human rights. I mean, there are countless reports from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, of Palestinian Authority abuses against Palestinians themselves. So this occupied people have to face injustices by the Israelis and by their own leadership, apparently. I mean, it's an untenable situation. It's a disgrace, actually. I think the PA has shown itself completely impotent. I mean, if the point of the PA, if it's the point of its creation was to bring Palestinians towards statehood, it's not only failed in ways that is actively working against this.
But it is actually working against this. As you're saying that, you know, the Palestinian authorities are afraid that if they were, that the US is going to stop funding them, that just shows that they're actually playing with the whole, you know, agenda, and they're actually a big part of the agenda against the Palestinians and for Israel to occupy more land, more Palestinian land, which is, very disgraceful.
It was interesting because I had an exchange with Saab Erekat early in February this year, and I criticized him, you know, for saying, well, the PA keeps promising to join the ICC and you haven't. And instead of arguing, he said, yes, you're right, and we should. And then when I kept pressing why they hadn't and when they would, firstly, he promised that it would be in April at the end of the negotiating process. Another broken promise. We're still no closer to joining the ICC. But later on, he said that if they joined the ICC, the PA would collapse because of the funding shortfall. And to me, that basically said indirectly that the reason why we haven't joined the ICC is because we don't want to collapse. We want to maintain the PA. But if the PA is not going to further the Palestinians towards their own state, towards their own rights, then what's the PA for? Other than to manage the occupation for Israel. That's not what
the PA is. But
they're
not really managing it anyway.
Well, they basically, Israel has subcontracted security in the Palestinian areas, in the occupied territories, in the populated centers. Security is contracted to the Palestinian Authority. They keep the Palestinians in check. So
they keep them in check, or they're abusing them?
Well, both. I mean, but you know, Israel has basically, to an extent, relied upon the Palestinian Authority to keep a check on its own people. So you know, protests are put down. You know, if Israel has lists of people they want to apprehend, the Palestinian Authority does it for them. This is a disgrace. I mean, this is an occupied people. The leadership should be helping them, not helping them being put down. So, you know.
Do you think that they would be doing another intifada anytime soon? The Palestinian people?
I think the anger is there and the justification is there. But at the moment, I think the situation on the ground is not conducive to it. For the simple fact that, firstly, you have a leadership, the Palestinian leadership seemingly would not back the uprising and may even oppose the uprising directly. You have such division among Palestinians, geographic division, political division, that you need, for an effective uprising, you need unification and you need a fixed strategy. There's no fixed strategy. You know, there are those who propose non-violent resistance, those who propose armed resistance. So in terms of strategy, politics, geography, the Palestinians are divided. They have a woefully incapable leadership who's not willing to endorse such a step. So I don't think the conditions are there. The anger and the justification are there, but the conditions at the moment are not. But I don't think that means that Israel should rest on its laurels, because, you know, just as the last two intifadas, they were not started by the leaderships. These were popular uprisings. And that happens when people are angry. It's not that people sit down in a conference hall and say, right, when are we going to rise up and how are we going to do it? This is a spontaneous movement that catches fire very quickly. So I think if Israel is relying on some kind of organized political Palestinian faction to say, this is when we're going to start and this is how we're going to do it, that's not going to happen. People will rise up and say, we've had enough, because it's an emotional reaction, and people will it'll then catch on. I think this is how the others started, and this is how a future one would start.
You said that they're not actually unified, like the Palestinian people, because we know that there's more than one party, there's more than one group. However, as you just said, like when they're angry, they all rise up together. It's a spontaneous thing. They don't actually sit down and decide, okay, on this day, on this time, we're going to be doing this. It just happens. Yeah. Don't you think because they have, you know, one enemy, and because they know that their government isn't actually helping them in any way, that they're just going to be rising up, and some people would be doing it by conferences and others would be doing it with
the problem this time compared to the previous uprisings is that they don't face one enemy. There would be two enemies. I mean, beforehand, the Palestinian leadership, they didn't lead the uprising, but they didn't oppose it. I mean, now you have the PA saying that there will be no uprising under Abbas's rule. So either they will not support it or they would actively oppose it. So the Palestinians will be facing potentially two enemies. And you have the political divisions are greater now than they ever were before during the previous uprisings. And also the geographic division is much more compared to the last uprising. I mean, Palestinian populations are so isolated from each other that it would be, any uprisings, they would be so localized that you need a national effort that simply isn't there on the ground. I mean, Gaza now is completely cut off. East Jerusalem's cut off from the West Bank. The West Bank is sliced up into, I don't know how many different fragments. Each population center is basically hemmed in. So that makes it very easy to put down local uprisings and very difficult to get a national movement that has any real effect. So, Israel has, to an extent successfully pursued this divide and rule policy, and the PA has largely acquiesced in this. So it's a very difficult situation, but in a way it makes it more dangerous because you have an angry population that doesn't feel that it has any representatives to channel that anger. And that actually could bring about a popular explosion even quicker because they don't feel that they have any avenue, that they don't have representatives to express that frustration or that would pursue strategies that would ease their plight.
Geographically speaking, as you said, Palestine is actually divided. But then, there are many Palestinians in like Jordan, in Lebanon. If they and the neighboring countries were also to help the Palestinians.
No, there's no. I mean, that's not going to happen. I mean, look at the situation of the refugees in these countries. The situation is already, is very, very shaky. I mean, in Lebanon, they're treated horrendously, and they are already also enclosed within certain camps and are barely allowed out. They're barely allowed to work. I mean, they can't do anything. I visited those camps. They are really treated like animals. Let's face it. That's how they're treated. And so in all these countries, in Syria, they have basically fled as well. They've fled the war. In Jordan, in these countries, they don't want to risk. They're already, very shaky conditions there. And what could they do? I mean, the authorities in these countries, they're not going to allow the refugees to
not
cross
the
the
authorities
border.
themselves, because the authorities, we just put them to a side because when it comes to Israel, they would never support the Palestinians because they would rather be in good terms with Israel.
But they would stop any actions to. I mean, if the refugees, what would they do? I mean, if they went to the border, they would either be stopped by the authorities in the neighboring countries, or they would be shot at by the Israelis. They have no qualms about shooting them. And what would these refugees do? They have nothing. They barely have the clothes on their back or food on the table. And when we've seen in previous occasions where there have been public demonstrations in the Arab world in support of the Palestinians, many times the authorities either forbid the protests or put them down or stop them from accessing borders. So I don't see what the refugees could feasibly do that would make any difference. I don't think Israel would feel any threat from them.
But then with the whole Israel threat, Israel knows that it's never actually going to be held accountable for anything because it's done so many tragic events and killed many civilians other than destructing buildings and causing a lot of everything.
Yeah, but look, I think there are firstly the boycott movement, the boycott, divestment and sanction movement is making great strides internationally. If I look, I mean, I was a proponent of this movement from its very first days, and I remember at the time that people would laugh at us and would laugh at the very idea. They would think they thought it was some kind of fanatic fringe movement that would never catch on. It's now a mainstream movement, and every week, there are BDS successes, around the world. Even as I said, in countries and regions whose governments are supportive of Israel. So that's an important avenue that's gaining access. If the PA would get off the behinds and apply to the ICC, legally this would be a major boost in itself towards the Palestinian aspirations, and it would help boost the BDS movement. So the PA is the one obstructing it, but that would be a major avenue that's still possible. And generally, and as we've talked about, the tide in European opinion again, turning against Israeli policies. In its general isolation around the world, Israel is more isolated now than it's ever been. So the tide is going definitely against Israel. So the situation at the moment now, it feels that it has a level of impunity, just as South Africa, the apartheid regime did. But this is not a situation that can go on indefinitely.
But then after the war that took place over the summer, when the many Palestinian movements were saying, to join the BDS, and many people did, and we were told that nothing else is going to be happening to Palestine. This is going to be stopping Israel from attacking more Palestinian territories, etc. But then after a few months, they're in Al-Aqsa, they're in Jerusalem. More settlers are coming in more than ever. And it's still kind of like the same situation. Yes, they're not, having the big war that they did, but they're still doing what they want. So it hasn't really affected like we were told it would.
It's affected in the sense that every time it commits these provocations or atrocities, its isolation is increasing, and I think it's almost acting like a petulant child. That it gets condemned and then it stamps its feet and does something else. But eventually, as I said, there are even people who are stalwart supporters of Israel are coming out and saying, we can't do this anymore. We cannot support these practices. There is a growing movement, a very significant and important growing movement within Jewish communities around the world. The groups that are rising up to oppose Israeli policy and say, listen, Zionism is not the same as Judaism, and we cannot condone Israel's actions. So even from within, from world Jewry, which Israel has traditionally relied upon, as supporters, more and more people in that community are saying, no, you don't speak for us. So I think there are important shifts happening. I think Israel is really in denial about these very important shifts that eventually are going to reach a point where Israel cannot continue to ignore them.
But the thing is, with the whole, boycott situation, the Israelis have a really good products and if we're going to look at the makeup section, they have the best quality. If we're going to look at the food, they also have the best, and so on. So it is kind of hard for individuals to stop that, and many people have, but then they still continue to get better products, not really saying where it's actually from.
Well, I mean, the strength of Israel's economy is highly, highly dependent on Europe and America. It is not in itself a successful, self-sustained economy. If it wasn't for trade with Europe, if it wasn't for billions of dollars in American aid every year, the economy wouldn't look anywhere near what it is now. And even the finance minister earlier this year said that even a partial European boycott would be felt in every Israeli pocket. Every Israeli would feel this under a partial boycott. So the economy on paper, yes, is very strong, but it's very weak in the sense that it's reliant on Europe and America for the success. And we've seen that in Europe, the situation now, I have never seen the tide of European opinion more opposed to Israeli policies in my lifetime. This has never been the case. And even in America, it's happening much slower. But polls are showing that there is less and less support among Americans for Israeli policies. So Israel is reliant on these regions, and opinion opinion is changing in both those regions.
But then with the Israeli economy as well, yes, they do rely with trade, but at the same time they also rely with weapons and so on. So because they test them on Palestinian people and then they would be selling them to other countries, that is still taking place though, and that I imagine has more money and more profit for Israel than other companies would.
Yeah, but again, part of the BDS movement is to pressure governments and companies that buy Israeli products, including weaponry, to not do that. And to an extent, that is making inroads into that industry, which is a hugely important industry to Israel. And conversely, there are countries, for instance, Britain and others, that are reviewing their military sales to Israel because they are worried that their weapons are being used against the Palestinians. So even in this, which is a crucial industry for Israel, inroads are being made.
So if because the elections are coming up soon in the UK, do you think if we had Liberal Democrats or the Labour Party, that their position with Israel would actually change?
It's difficult to say because it's always easier in opposition to say yes, we'll stand for this, and then when it comes to party politics and being in power, this may change. It's difficult to say, and certainly I've had many meetings with government officials in this country under the Conservatives and under Labour, and personally I didn't see any difference. But the way I look at it, there are so many hurdles to overcome in terms of forcing Israel to comply with international law, with human rights law. But when I look at it in the sense that I've been an activist for the Palestinian cause for 20 years now, and I've never seen such international support for Palestinians and international opposition to Israel as I see today. So I look at the long term and I look at the shift, and the landscape is completely different. It was a real struggle when I started out. It was a real struggle even to get the Palestinian narrative across, and now we have made great strides. That doesn't mean that we don't have a long way to go. We do, but if we look at where we've come, this is where I gain my hope, is that we've made such strides and we'll continue to make them.
We hope to continue to make them, but then, with what's actually happening in Palestine, is there going to be a Palestine, in the next 5 years? Because what Israel is actually doing is just shifting the Palestinians as much as it can, to the extent where we can barely see it on the map. Like, you literally have to zoom in to see the areas of where Palestinians are.
Well, I don't think we're going to see a Palestinian state in 5 years. I'm not sure we will see a Palestinian state. As I said, I think the two-state solution, I think the debate has gone beyond whether it's preferable. I think the argument now is whether it's possible, and I don't think it's possible anymore. So Israel is going to have to come to a point at some stage where they have to decide what this one state looks like. And an apartheid state cannot be an indefinite thing. So I think Israel has created a situation where eventually it's going to have to accept that there are going to be two peoples living in one country that should be equal under the law, whether Israel likes it or not.
So it's still going to be called Israel?
I don't know. It's difficult to say. But two states now is no longer possible.
Two states, we know it's
and an increasing number of Palestinians are turning to this idea that, whether we like a one state or not, this is the inevitability. So how do we make this work? And I think Israelis are going to be turning to this as well. They're going to see that this is a situation that is untenable. So, how do we make it work? And I think I don't know what the state will look like. But if you look at apartheid South Africa, that collapsed, quickly because people saw that it was not a tenable situation. I think eventually the same will happen with Israel.
But then, the Arabs that are in Israel, what is their situation? How come they're actually living in Israel?
Well, they were the Palestinians who did not flee or were not kicked out in the 1948 war, and they eventually got Israeli citizenship, but they're not even second-class citizens; they're third-class citizens. Israel is a democracy for Jews only, and they are discriminated against in every facet of life. From state funding, all the way down. So for them, their situation is untenable as well. But even just their population is 20% of the Israeli population, and it's growing. The birth rate is much higher. So again, you can't. How long can Israel continue to keep even just that population discriminated against? But when you look at the entire Palestinian population, a country cannot keep discriminating against a population that actually outnumbers very soon the population of the people that are doing the oppressing. It's not numerically and strategically, it's not possible eventually.
If the Palestinians were to take the Israeli citizenship, would that make the situation in Palestine differ?
Well, it depends. If that citizenship came with genuine equal rights, then yeah, maybe it would. But as we've seen, the Israeli Palestinians, they've had citizenship for decades. But their situation continues to get worse because it's citizenship in name only. It doesn't give them equality, and that's the crux of the issue. It's not citizenship; it's equality.
It is equality, and we know that the Palestinians, the Arabs, they would never be equal in Israel. But then, even like the Israelis themselves, if they do not join the army, then they're not treated, just like another person who actually did join the army would be treated. So in terms of equality, we know that wouldn't actually happen. But then, would it make, if the Palestinians were to become Israeli citizens, would that make the whole one-state solution quicker and would actually take place better? Like there wouldn't be much war, basically.
As I said, it depends, because it depends what citizenship entails, whether any equality promised would be implemented. There will of course be a great deal of opposition in Israel, and also it depends on how the Palestinians embrace this. I think a one-state solution, I think what would need to be done was for the Palestinian leaderships to say, we are abandoning the two-state idea because it's no longer practical, and we are now putting our weight behind a one-state solution. That hasn't happened yet. Neither party has said that, the Hamas or Fatah. So that would need to be the case. But also, and I think this is why the Palestinian Authority won't do it, is if the PA did do that, it basically renders them obsolete. So they would have to dissolve themselves and say, right, we are not here. We can't get a two-state solution. We're not here to maintain the occupation. So we're done. I think as long as the Palestinians don't have a leadership that's willing to support officially the one-state solution, that's going to keep it further at bay.
Fortunately, you have run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.